What I'm going to focus on this talk today is metta, loving kindness. And just to help us enter into that space, I'm going to start by sharing a friend of mine, two friends of mine have created a little video of the Metta Sutta in Pali. So I'm going to just start by sharing that with you, and we'll just sit for a couple of minutes and then I'll begin the talk. So
Karaniyana takushalena yantam santam padam abhishamecha saku uju cha suju cha suvachocha samudu anatimani Santu sakocha suvarocha apakichocha salahu kavuti santidriyocha nipakocha apagabokulesu ananuguido Nachakudam samachari kinchi Yena venu pare upavadeyum Sukhino va kemino hontu Sabe sata bhavantu sukhitata Yeke chipana bhutati Tasavatavara Vaanavasesa Digavaye Mahantava Majimarasaka Anukatula Ditavaye Vadita Yechadure Vasan Ti Avidure Bhutavasam bhavesiva Sabe sata bhavantu sukhitata Naparo param nikubeta Nati manyeta kata china kanchi Yaro sanya pantiga sanya Nana manya sasa dukamichiya Matayatani yam putam ayusaeka putamunarakihi Ivan pisa babutesu manasambhavaye aparimanyam Metancha sabalokasmim manasambhavaye aparimanyam Udamado chatiryancha asabadamavar amasapatam Titam charam nisinova Sayanuvayava tasavigatam ido itam satim aditeya brahmamitam viharam idamahu ditam cha anupagama silavadasanen asampano Kamesu vinyagidan nahi jatu gabe seyam punareti
So hopefully that sets a tone for the talk. And I am now going to completely destroy the tone by taking you to the 1960s. And some of you will remember this. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. That's the only thing that there's just too little of. Burt Bacharach, some of you will be old enough to remember that, I would imagine, looking at the screen. And you remember perhaps that he wrote that in the context of the Vietnam War. So it's often heard as a love song, but it's actually more a protest song. And in a way, the Metta Sutta that we heard before is also a rather more beautiful and profound, but in a sense also a protest song. So the Buddha, 2,500 years before the Vietnam War, was talking about the need for love and for metta, and his context was samsara. His context was the whole of conditioned existence, and that's where we still find ourselves. So I'm imagining from looking at the screen that I've got in front of me that most of you are probably familiar with the Metta Sutta and with metta as a practice. But I don't want to assume that to be the case, so I am going to say quite a bit that might seem quite basic. But basic's not a bad thing, and it's often good to just remind ourselves of the basics. So metta, loving kindness, solidarity, love, all those things. And we're probably most of us familiar with the meditation practice that's based on this sutta. It's a very important meditation practice. I truly believe it is perhaps the most important thing that we can offer the world. And it's also a text which has been very important to me in my practice. So this talk is really just me sharing some personal thoughts. And it's a help to me to remind me that it's important to remember the importance of metta, if that makes sense. So apologies to Jnana Chandra if that was a sentence with too many bits in it. So I gave a similar talk to this for the Glasgow Sangha, the Scottish Sangha, at the beginning of this year of 2021. Wasn't an easy time to give a talk about metta. Wasn't an easy context in a way. It was just days after Trump supporters had invaded Capitol Hill. And I actually found that deeply, deeply distressing to watch those scenes of what is purported to be the home of democracy, as it were, being invaded by people who had a very particular view of what was happening. It seemed to be the assailing of something unassailable, not only in practical or physical terms, but also in a more abstract sense. It felt like it was an act which undermined democracy and undermined a kind of belief in fairness, that there had been an election, there were results to that, and yet there was this very strong core of people who believed genuinely that those results were fixed. So that was probably just maybe 2 or 3 days before I gave this talk. All sorts of other things had been happening. There was, we were 10 months into, or 8 months into lockdown. We'd come out of lockdown. We'd gone back into lockdown. There was the whole sense of the pandemic gaining force again at that point at the beginning of this year. Brexit was, for those of us here on the British Isles that are on this call, quite a few of you, however one voted in that referendum, whatever one felt about Brexit, I'm pretty sure people would be unlikely to be happy with the outcome of it. So that was 8-9 months ago. I don't think the world's got any better in those 8 or 9 months, personally. And there are many other things, what's happened in Afghanistan, the flood of refugees, certainly here in the UK, the hostile environment to refugees, the hostile environment to so much. And of course, the climate emergency becoming more and more obvious. And I know that that's, for many of us in this call, many of us taking part in this conference, this is the most crucial and the most, maybe not the most important, but certainly the most urgent and the most crucial emergency at the moment. So quite recently in August, we had the last report from the IPCC, which said climate change is widespread, rapid and intensifying, and some trends are now irreversible, at least during the present time frame. It was called by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that this was nothing less than a code red for humanity. He said the alarm bells are deafening, the evidence is irrefutable. I certainly felt quite distressed at reading that. I felt a whole variety of responses. I felt angry, I felt upset, I felt depressed. I kind of thought, what's the point? Is there still a point? Is it too late for everything? I felt overwhelmed, I felt angry, I felt my hedonistic side creep in. I partly thought, well, if this is the case, maybe I'll just go out and get stoned, drunk, maybe I'll just look for some hedonistic pleasure. I'd like you to know I did none of those things. I'm just sharing my responses. So Antonio Guterres had on Twitter, I follow him on Twitter, and he said about this report, he said, the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions are choking our planet and placing billions of people in danger. Global heating is affecting every region on Earth, with many of these changes becoming irreversible. We must act decisively now to avert a climate catastrophe. So I read that on Twitter one morning just before I led the 7:30 meditation in the Buddhist Centre online, some of the regulars of whom I can see on this screen. I read it like at 6:30 and then I sat on my balcony and then I led the meditation. And I thought metta is a very challenging response to this, by which I mean it's quite challenging to continue to feel love and metta when faced with this kind of news. However, I also felt through my morning meditation that metta, in fact, was the only response, that there was no other response possible, no other response available. So I went to explore the sutta with you. I went to pull out some of the points from the sutta and suggest that it's kind of a mission statement for those of us who wish to be revolutionaries in the face of global catastrophe. So I'm going to read it and I'm going to just share the sutta online so that if you're not familiar with it, you can see it. So it's not the whole, that's it. It's not the whole sutta. I've chosen a bit from it. And I think this translation's Sharon Salzberg. In gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards, unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, in gladness and in safety. May all beings be at ease. I just find that so beautiful, so moving, and so challenging all at the same time. In gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. So straight away we find an attitude of solidarity with all living beings. And the word safety strikes me, the word safety jumps out at me. So many in our world do not feel safe. The pandemic's created a sense of not feeling safe. For many, the political situation means that they don't feel safe. The climate emergency means that many of us don't feel safe. If we have children, if we have grandchildren, I'm sure we worry about the world that we're leaving them. And one of the things that strikes me most where I feel unsafe is how extraordinarily polarised the world has become. There is so much polarisation. I catch myself being caught up in it, even in situations where I wouldn't expect to find polarisation. It feels like polarisation's rife. And I find it very painful. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't analyse a situation or criticise situations or hold people and things, institutions, hold them to, what's the word? Account, thank you. I have a friend in the room with me here, helping me from the side. So yeah, we should of course hold people and institutions to account when we see prejudice, when we see hatred, when we see injustice, racism, homophobia, transphobia, any of those things that others and causes pain. Of course, we need to find ways to call that out. But what this sutta is saying to us, and what this practice is saying to us is, can we do this with a heart that can still love? And that's the challenge. Can I call out racism, injustice? Can I really analyse the problems of our world without closing off to love? That's the challenge. A heart that's still able to love is a heart that can respond. Because if we can't keep our heart open, a loving heart, then we too become part of the problem. We too become part of the polarised situation. Again, the Buddha in the Dhammapada, one of the very earliest of Buddhist texts, we hear this. He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who harbour such thoughts, hatred is not appeased. He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who do not harbour such thoughts, hatred is appeased. Hatred never ceases through hatred in this world. Through love alone does it cease. This is the eternal law. So, hatred never ceases through hatred in this world. Through love alone does it cease. I do truly believe that. And I'm reminded of when I was young, And Shantichitta mentioned this in her introduction. I considered myself a young wee activist in the 70s. And I was one of these people that would stand in a street corner and scream at people for world peace. I would angrily shout at people about what they were doing wrong and about what they needed to be doing. It was not very effective, and it didn't leave me in a particularly good space either. But it's very understandable. To stay connected as we challenge is not easy. To move ourselves into the face of what we find difficult, what we are genuinely angry about. And anger is not necessarily a negative response. There's so much to be angry about. It's what we do with that response. Do we feed it? Do we actually get into the stories that make that anger more? Or are we able to catch it and just realise it's a human response, but it's not the response that I want to bring into the world? And there's so much insecurity in the world at the moment, to go back to the feeling of looking for safety. You know, I'm a bit of a politics junkie still. I'm a news junkie. I like to follow the news. I struggle to find good sources for the news. I struggle to find sources that don't give me biased news and make me more angry than I was to begin with. But one of the things that I've followed and I find very scary is the rise of popularist politics across the globe. By which I mean the radicalisation of people based on their fear. And, I think this is something that's really taken root in certain parts of Europe, particularly Hungary and Poland come to mind, and in the USA. And actually, it's becoming much more prevalent here in the UK, in my own society. I like to think of Scotland as a welcoming, diverse, inclusive society. And overall, I'd like to think that's true. But more and more, I see the rise of fear being appropriated against certain groups. A wee quote here from Chomsky, and it's from a few years ago, and he's talking about Trump. He's talking about President Trump's rise in American politics. So I can't remember when. It's probably from about 2017 or something. And he says, this is Chomsky. It's an article about the breakdown of American society and the gap that leaves and how populism fills that gap. And he says, Trump is appealing to those who sense and experience the breakdown of society, to their deep feelings of anger, fear, frustration, and hopelessness. Probably among certain sectors of the population that are now seeing an increase in mortality, something unheard of apart from war. So I took that to mean that certain parts of society, and I see it here in the UK in certain very working class areas, where there's a lot of unemployment, there's a lot of poverty, and that poverty breeds fear, and it breeds fear of other. So it's very easy to then have a dialogue about how immigrants are coming to take away your jobs, about how your society is going to be taken over by Muslims, by anything that's other to you. Oh God, I see it in so many ways. I need to watch, or I'll just end up spending the rest of this talk talking about the rise of populism and the horrible and awful things that's doing. And that isn't the point of my talk. I want to be inspiring rather than just talk about what I find worrying. But I find that quote interesting because I think there is such a gap at the moment. I think there is a lacuna, a gap which allows for something to come through. Fear is such, it's so prevalent. So going back to the sutra, May all beings be at ease. This is the exact opposite of that fear. You know, fear means we are diseased. We're not able to relax or be at ease if we're in fear. So to bring metta into our relationships is to work against fear. Back to the sutta. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short or small. So it's important here that the sutra says whatever living beings there are. It doesn't say whatever human beings there are. It says whatever living beings there are. Because Buddhist ethics and ethics are very connected with metta. If metta is love, then our ethical practice is how do we live from that basis of love? How do we relate to others? And Buddhist ethics are biocentric rather than anthropocentric. They don't just talk about how we relate to other human beings. And this seems relevant now, perhaps more than ever. What that's saying is the whole of the human family and beyond, all animals, all plants, the biosphere, the planet, the globe, all of those things are worthy of our metta, are worthy of our love. So this widens our perspective, and I think that's really important because it's so easy for our perspective to become narrow. And again, to think if we're coming from a place of fear, and if that fear is being inculcated and fed, if the fire of our fear is being fanned, then to a great extent our perspective will narrow. So this sutra is saying widen your perspective. Remember that there's a lot beyond what you're immediately experiencing. And this comes in the next bit of the sutta. The seen and the unseen, near and far away. So this sutta is saying you don't just feel love for those that are close to you. It's it's relatively easy to feel love to those closest. It has to be acknowledged that sometimes that's also where we feel most irritation and most anger are those that are close to us. You know, you always hurt the one you love, another soul from the 60s. It's relatively easy, though, seriously, to love and protect those that we think of as ours. Those that we think of as not just me and mine, but we and ours. David Lloyd talks in one of his books about the we-go as well as the ego, which I always find quite helpful. So it's not only those ours that we think of in the most immediate sense, my family, my friends, my community, my neighbours, but we make groups of that. And then again to think of that polarisation, often as we identify as one group, that identification only makes sense when it's defined in opposition to some other group. So again, we have this in the sutta, we have this sense of really trying to break down these barriers, really trying to break down that sense of otherness. And given the situation of our world, not least in the climate, but not only the climate emergency, a sense of global ethics and globalisation seems crucial. It's not enough to act just in terms of me and mine, because everything that I do for me, for mine, has a global effect. The ripples are broader and broader. And our planet, our world is increasingly globalised for good and for bad. Peter Singer, in his book, One World Now, The Ethics of Globalisation, really interesting book. He talks about this, exactly this, how easy it is to act ethically to those that we see or those that are in our immediate environment, but how it becomes more and more abstract the further away we go from our immediate centre. And talking about in the ethics of globalisation, I think this is a really interesting. One of the interesting things about the climate emergency is that if we don't feel its effect on us immediately, and many of us live in situations where it doesn't affect us as immediately as it will affect people in some other parts of the world, where it's already affecting hugely and causing a massive amount of destruction. But it's causing that to the poorest nations in the world. And many of us are living, the worst that the climate emergency does to us perhaps is flooding, which in no way am I minimising, but most of us have ways to deal with how the climate emergency impacts on us. That's not the case for people living in many, many parts of the world. The impact is much stronger. So if we're thinking about the global climate emergency, I think it's fairly easy sometimes to just not know really the truth of it. We don't necessarily know it from immediate experience, and we can get overwhelmed by the amount of information. Anyway, Pete Singer talks about this, about how do we assess something that doesn't impact on us immediately. And I found this quite interesting, actually, this quote. So this is him writing in response to the 5th IPCC report, which was in 2014. So quite a long time back, and things have moved on, but I think it's still quite relevant. Those of us who have no expertise in the scientific aspects of assessing climate change and its causes can scarcely disregard the views held by the overwhelming majority of those who do possess that expertise. Even if all of them were in agreement, it would still be possible that they are wrong. And this is the important part. He says, in view of what's at stake, to rely on that possibility would be playing Russian roulette with hundreds of millions and possibly billions of lives at stake. I found that quite sobering. I read that some years ago, and I've offered it occasionally to people I know, friends of mine who still don't believe that what's happening with the climate is due to man-made, or is man-made climate change. Because it seems to me that even if we don't know, and even if we don't experience it immediately, surely it's still worth acting as if. And in a way, when it comes to anything more abstract than our immediate experience, we're often acting as if. So not only in terms of the climate, but also to not make other of those that we don't understand. So another quote, I'm afraid, sorry, I feel this talk's a wee bit all over the place. In my defence, I am actually on retreat this week, and I would like to have had a little bit more space to prepare something wonderful for you, but this is the best you're getting, so it is a little bit all over the place. But another quote, this is also thinking about how do we bear in mind those who are not in our immediate situation. I'll just pause to let Jnana Chandra catch up with me. Okay, so another ethics book that I rather like is Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers. So I don't know if any of you have come across this. It's by the British Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Appiah. And he says in that, the challenge is to take minds and hearts formed over the long millennia of living in local troops and equip them with ideas and institutions that will allow us to live together as the global tribe we have now become. Find that deeply moving. I'm going to read it again so you really take it in. The challenge then is to take minds and hearts formed over the long millennia of living in local troops and equip them with ideas and institutions that will allow us to live together as the global tribe we have become. So becoming more and more aware, opening our perspective to the perspective of the Metta Sutta, the seen and the unseen, near and far away. So however we act here, be aware, wherever here is for you, be aware that that impacts in a much broader sense than we generally think. And then the sutta says, born and to be born. Future generations, what kind of world are we leaving? Again, very much in the ecosphere, very much for those eco-sattvas among us, we're thinking ahead of what world we're leaving, of what's happening to the climate and what's happening to the globe. But also socially, what are we leaving? One of the things that struck me very strongly through the last year or so of the pandemic, I think the coronavirus made it very obvious in a very physical way how interconnected and global this world is. There was no escaping that. Really, there was no escaping how contagious things are. And there was a lot of talk about solidarity and about resetting the world. And I think for me, one of my biggest worries about the coronavirus pandemic is that we go back to normal. Because normal was not good enough. So I really hope that global governments, as well as individuals, can really see this as an opportunity. I don't have a lot of faith that this will happen across the world. It might happen in some places. The Scottish Government certainly give voice to this. We'll see. The powers are strong against such changes. But really, if we can see this as an opportunity to create a better world and not just go back to the world that we had before, then I think that would be wonderful. And really to have that, again, that big perspective, which is not only globally big in terms of geography and in terms of place, but also big in terms of time, to really break through this sense that we're only in the immediate without thinking. It's like, can we live fully in the present and keep perspective for the future? Again, I think the Metta Sutta gives us this option, this possibility. So not to deceive or despise is also a line in the sutta. The sutta says, just spread back, it says, let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. How beautiful is that? To not despise, to not deceive, to respect the dignity of all beings, not just human beings, but the dignity of all beings. And that is the world that I want us to leave for our children. I don't have physical children, that's not a path that I particularly followed. But I care deeply about the children of my friends and their children. And just generally, I don't want to sound too sentimental, but I care about the children of the world. I care about the future. So the metta allows us to respect the dignity of all beings, not only in the present, but in the future. And let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Anger is a really human, understandable response to the world right now. If I didn't feel anger, about some things that I see happening around me, I'd kind of worry about myself because I don't think indifference is a possible response. I guess a real beautiful response would be love and detachment. But for most of us, as we hear what's happening and we see what's happening, and we see the catastrophic effects of things around us, we will feel many, many things, and anger is a really human response to that. But the sutta's saying it doesn't take us beyond. And the sutta tells us, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Again, I'm not a mother, but I can see quite a lot of people on this screen who I know are mothers. And talking to friends of mine, I remember a conversation I had with a friend of mine many, many years ago who had adopted a daughter. And he was telling me how immediately they collected their child, on the journey home, he immediately felt he would kill anybody that harmed this child. And his partner hadn't given birth to this child. He hadn't contributed in a biological sense to the birth of this child. And yet, as soon as he held this child in his arms and took responsibility for that life, he said it changed completely how he saw the world. I found that really, really interesting and really inspiring. So, and he also said that it made him realise how potent these lines in the Metta Sutta actually are. And that before feeling that he was a parent, he thought, just as a mother protects wildlife, that's lovely, that's delightful. Of course a mother would protect, but he said, no. As soon as he held that child, it was visceral. It was in his guts. It wasn't just in his mind anymore. So trying to develop that and then allowing it to spread out, to feel that strong, maybe not that we would kill people, maybe that's a step too far, but to feel that we would protect every single living being with that power and that passion, that we care that much. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. So this is describing the meditation practice. That this metta, this love, this care, this solidarity, this respect that we're developing radiates outwards in all directions. In case there's anybody on the call that has never done this practice, I strongly recommend that you look on the YouTube Buddhist Centre Online channel or any of our Buddhist Triratna centres that teach the Metta Bhavana. It's a wonderful practice. It totally transforms the world. But just to say very quickly about it, we do the practice in stages, and we're developing love, solidarity, kindness, respect in stages, first to ourselves, because without that, where would we be? And then to someone that we already hold dear, and then to someone who we don't really mind one way or the other. They're kind of neutral. But then the challenge that we feel love for someone who we dislike or who causes us some pain, causes us some dis-ease. And this is where the challenge of the practice is really fabulous. Because it doesn't mean that we pretend to like this person, not even to ourselves. So we might choose someone in our sphere of influence, somebody in our life. We might choose somebody. When I first started to do this, or quite early on in me learning to do this, I had Mrs. Margaret Thatcher in the 4th stage of my Metta Bhavana on a regular basis. a British politician who I personally did not love. And I would put her into my 4th stage of the Metta Bhavana, and I would really struggle until it clicked that I wasn't actually being asked to like this person or to agree with this person. But what I was trying to do in the practice was to accept, to recognise that in fact, even though this person had so many views and actions that I didn't agree with, I could still remain big enough in my heart to feel a solidarity with this other human being and to continue to wish that human being well, even while I did not agree with so much that she was doing and saying. And it was a real turning point for me, that to realise that I didn't have to admit this person to my kind of, that I liked them or that I was ever going to really enjoy what was happening coming from this person. But metta was something beyond that. It was something different. It was not about liking or disliking. It was about going beyond that polarisation between like and dislike and having a heart big enough to contain those in the world that I do not agree with and still wish them well. So it's an important point that the practice of Metta Bhavana gives us a way to work directly with our mental states in terms of our response to people. But I'm moving towards the end of the talk, but I want to just make the point here that it's not just a meditation practice. It's a way of life, it's an attitude. It's a way to actually come into relationship. Because I firmly believe, although my Buddhist practice is central to my life and my meditation practice is crucial to my Dharma practice, I personally believe it's not enough. Somebody, a wise person, once asked the question, is bliss enough? And I thought, well, I wouldn't mind a bit of the bliss, but it's not enough. It's only really a basis to move forward from. Another quote, and then I'll move on to conclusion. So this is from Bhikkhu Bodhi. And he says, I believe if we as Buddhists are to adequately respond to the needs of our age, we will have to rise to the challenge. It won't suffice for us merely to adopt Buddhist teachings as a route to deeper self-fulfillment. A predominantly personal approach to spiritual growth falls short of Buddhism's ethical ideals and misses half its message. Greed, hatred and delusion are not only in our mind, but in the food we eat, the gas we put in our cars, and the movies we turn to for entertainment. The Buddha taught the Dharma on the basis of a far-reaching vision that pierced the depths of suffering in both its personal and collective dimensions. He offered this teaching not only as a method to tame the mind, but also as a standard for ennobling us in all dimensions of our being, including the social, political and economic. His discourses on lay ethics, communal harmony and the duties of a king are testimony to his panoramic awareness. I agree with that completely. I agree, and I worry sometimes that Western Buddhism, I worry sometimes that many in Triratna can be overly inward looking. We don't need to choose the path of contemplation in comparison to the path of activism. One of the things I love dearly about Buddhism is I can be a contemplative activist, or I can be an active contemplative. I don't need to make that choice. I believe that the questions that face our planet today, the questions of poverty, of discrimination, of environmental issues, I believe these are moral questions, not political questions. I believe they're human questions, and that anything that's a philosophy or a religion needs to address these questions as much as addressing the mind in terms of one's individual mental states. As Dharma practitioners, at least speaking for myself, I must remember that these problems, these issues, are there in the world to be tackled, and I must remember to come to them from a dharmic analysis. Greed, hatred, and delusion taught by the Buddha are still stalking our planet. They exist in every individual, and they exist in the groups that those individuals form. They exist in the widest sense. They exist in nation states. Greed, hatred, and delusion exist in all our institutions. Ego clinging is the root of all our problems. So metta is a way to break through that false separation of self and other. Not only is an individual trying to work against selfing and othering within my own personal life and experience, but also in any group that I find myself part, to try to help create conditions where that group does not polarize with other groups, and that we act in accordance with metta. I became involved in the Dharma not only because I felt I needed to change myself, which I did feel, but because I really wanted a way to create a better world. And I genuinely came to believe, God, that sounds like a song again. I came to believe that the only real way to do that, to create a better world, was to bring Buddhist values into relationship with that world. I still believe this to be true. I don't think we'll ever create a Buddhist world. I don't know if we would ever want to create a Buddhist world, but a world that's deeply imbued by and affected by Buddhist values can only be a good thing. That great Indian bodhisattva and revolutionary Dr. Ambedkar said very firmly that the Dharma was the surest basis for a truly just society. He put that into practice and helped create changes in Indian society in a massive scale that affected and continue to affect millions of people. He believed that the Dharma would help create a truly just society. I also believe that, and I believe that the world needs this. So I'll finish by asking all of us here in the call to practice metta in our lives. And metta is broad and deep and wonderful, and it can include so many things. It can include the grief that we feel when we hear about the problems of our planet. It can include the mourning that we might feel when we realise that what we love will be lost. Even just in a practical and immediate sense, the Buddha taught that all that we love will be lost to us. But we can see this in the world as well, and we can mourn the folly, the stupidity of humanity, dragging us surer and surer ways towards destruction. We can mourn that, but we can learn to also love, and love more deeply that which we may lose ere long. And we can try to learn to come at these things not from hate, but from love. So this sutta, which I feel to be, as I said at the beginning, almost a mission statement for changing the world, it asks us to become a beacon of love in a hate-filled world, to become bringers of peace to a troubled world, to create solidarity in a deeply polarised world, and to bring love into a world often driven by hate. Because hatred never ceases through hatred in this world. Through love alone does it cease. This is an eternal law. And if I may finish by quoting another revolutionary, not from a dharmic perspective in this case, but Che Guevara, a great hero of my youth and childhood. He says, "At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality." So I would say, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by metta. So let us, who want to change the world, become true and loving revolutionaries. Let us create a safe haven in a fear-filled world, so that we can say, in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Thank you.